Daf Pei Tes Amud Aleph, Perek Kol Gagos. So the Mishnah, Kol Gagos Ha'ir Rishus Achas. All of the rooftops, are considered one Rishus. Ubelvad Shelo Yeheh Gag Gavai Yud Oy Nomoch Yud. As long as one roof isn't higher or lower than the other by Yud Tvachim. Div Rav Meir. That's the sheet of Rav Meir. Now, as we know, that a Rishus HaYochid, an enclosed area, and an area that's enclosed and it has mechitzas, or that it's yud tvachim high and dalar al dal is rishus hayochid. Min ha'Torah, transferring from one rishus hayochid to another rishus hayochid is mutter. The yisur is rishus hayochid to rishus harabim, or vice versa. The rabbanan aser mid rabbanan that without an eruv you can't transfer from different rishuyos hayochid, as we saw previously that from one chotzer that's a chotzer that's owned by one owner to a chotzer that's owned by a different owner, you need a ruvei chatzeres. The issue in this Mishnah and this parak is if you have other types of domains, how do we consider them? Do we consider them to be separate? Now, Rav Meir says that if you have rooftops, and even if the roofs are owned by different owners, you could transfer from one to the other. In those days, people used to use, there were flat roofs, and people used to use the roofs. They were used for areas, to store things, to living areas. Even if the roofs are owned by different owners, Rav Meir says, it is permitted, you are allowed to transfer from one rooftop to the other rooftop without an eruv. Without an eruv, it's mutter. And the reason given is that Rashi explains is that roofs are not used to the same extent that houses are. So now that even though by houses we say that you can't transfer from one to the other from different ownerships, but because that has an appearance of transferring from Rishus HaYochid to Rishus HaRabim, different owners use the house, they're used frequently, so you're transferring to different rishuyas. But the rooftops are not used that frequently, so according to Rav Meir, this does not go into the takana, the gzera, the isser rabbanon of transferring without eruv chatzeres. However, there's a side reason, a side gzera, which we'll see in the Gemara, that one cannot be higher or lower yud tvachim than the other. And we'll see in the Gemara what the reason for that gzera is. That is the shita of Rav Meir. They say that no, each rooftop is a separate rishus, and you cannot carry from one to the other without an eruv. Without an eruv, you can't carry from one to the other. Just like you say that by chatzeres, you say by rooftops as well. But Rabbi Shimon Omer, he said, Echad gagos, ve'echad chatzeres, ve'echad karpipos. Rabbi Shimon says no. He says that roofs or chatzeres or karpipos, open areas that are enclosed. They're not enclosed for residential purposes, but they're open areas that are enclosed, and do not exceed sasayim. He says that Rishus Achas hein lekelem sheshavsel l'seichan. If they're kalim that on the onset of Shabbos, they were not in the house, they were in any one of these areas, but not in the house, then we consider all of these areas to be a Rishus Achas. And therefore, you can carry then from one to the other. And even not only from a gag to a gag, but from a gag to a chotzer, or vice versa, and to a carpet. It's all considered, it's Rishus Achas and L'Kelim Sheshavsel L'Soichan, but V'loi L'Kelim Sheshavsel B'Soich HaBayis. But if Kelim or Sheshavsel B'Soich HaBayis were in the house on the onset of Shabbos, when Shabbos came in, then you cannot carry it, if it came into the chotzer, you cannot carry it from a chotzer to a gag or to a carpet, etc. And as we'll see later on, that Rav Shimon says that when it's in the house on the onset of Shabbos, this restriction applies. It applies not only if there's different owners, but it applies even if it's the same owner. For the same owner, for him to take kelim that were shafsel l'seich habayis, and then to take them if they went out of the house into the chotzer and take it from the chotzer to a karpav, would be also. So this we have the shitas in the Mishnah. Do we say, according to Rav Meir, he says the gagos are all considered one rishus. You don't need an eruv to transfer from gag to gag, even if they're separate owners. But that's as far as gag to gag. He would say that gag and chotzer and karpav are considered separate rishus. Rav Shimon says even Gag, Chatzar, and Karpov are also considered one Rishus. The Chum say they're all considered separate Rishus. So just like you cannot transfer from a Gag to just like you can't transfer from a Chatzar to a different Chatzar, you cannot transfer from a Gag to a Gag. You can't transfer from a Gag to a Chatzar or a Gag to a Karpov. They're all considered separate Rishuyas. So the Gemara, Yosef Abai Barav, Rabbi Chanina Barav, Yosef Abai Gabai, Yosef Kamer, and they were discussing the Mishnah, and they said as follows: Bishlam Rabbanan. We understand the sheet of the Rabbanan that say you cannot transfer from Gag to Gag because Savri Kishem Shid Yirn Chaluk Lamata Kach Yirn Chaluk Lamala. They say just like the houses are considered separate diurin. Just like you say in the houses, they're considered separate residents, separate owners. You can't transfer from one to another. If there's different owners, you can't transfer from one to the other. So they hold similarly, so too we say that the usage and the residence of what's below, it extends to what's on top of the roof as well. It extends to what's on top. And therefore, just like below, you can't transfer from one Rishus Hayochad to the other if there's different ownerships. So too on the Gagais, you can't transfer to the different rooftops if there are different ownerships. So we understand the Shita of the Rabbanan. Rav Meir, Micah Savar, but Rav Meir, what does he hold? If he similarly says that we make a chilik, we say that just like there are different ownerships, different usage, different domains on the bottom. Within the houses, they're considered separate, so too they're considered separate on top. Then, if that's the case, am I Rishus Achasein? Why are they considered one Rishus? Why can you transfer from one rooftop to the other without an error? And if you say they're not chalukin, if you say that no, we don't say that they're just like they're different below, they're different, separate on top. We say whatever on top is considered all one. Since the usage over there is not that frequent, even if they're different ownerships, we'd say it's all considered one. They're not considered separate. Well, if that's the case, if you look at Nami, we should say it also whether the rooftops are higher or lower than 10. What difference should that make? If the rooftops are not considered to be separate, then what difference does it make on the height of them? By answers, you didn't hear what he said, that he explained it, that anytime, any place that you find two rishuyas where are one and one rishus, meaning that it's really one rishus. They're in a rishus yachid, but they're two rishuyas, they're distinct. What is that? Kigoy. If you have a post in a Rishus Yachid that's 10 tvachim high and it is 4 tvachim wide. Now, normally the definition of Rishus is if you have, for instance, mechitzas which are 10 high and enclosing an area which is dalet on dalet, or if you have a post which is 10 high which has a width of dalet. So that's considered a separate domain. Now, over here, we're talking in a Rishus Yachid. So if you have this inner Rishus Yachid, essentially it's all in the same Rishus. But you have to have a post that's 10 high and dalet wide. It is something that has the physical characteristics of a separate Rishus. Meaning, so for instance, if this post would be in a Rishus Harabim, so it's in a Rishus Harabim, it's in a town square, it's in a street, and you have a post or a pedestal that has that dimension, the top of it is a Rishus Yachid. So that would be a Rishus Yachid, and therefore placing objects from the street onto that pedestal or onto that post would be Aser, would be a Deraisa, would be transferring from Rishus Harabim to Rishus Yachid. Rameir says that this Isser that he says, Bulvad, that the Gagais can't have different elevations, it's not part of the takana of the Gzera of the Eruva Chatzeres. It is something, it's a separate gzera entirely. Really, as far as transferring from one gag to another gag, then it really makes no difference what the height of the gagas are. We say the gagas, we do not consider them to be distinct and separate. They all consider to be one, and even if they're different owners, you can transfer from one to the other without Eruv Chatzeres. However, there's a zaytig, a separate gzera. Just like if you would have a post in Rishus Harab, that would be 10 high and a width of dalet. Transferring from the street to the post would be Nisr Deraisa. We're geyser, we make a gzera, that when you have that type of scenario, even in Rishus HaYachid, it is also to transfer from one to the other, because you might transfer and take from a street. In the case where the post is in the street, you might take from the street and put it on the post. So we're geyser, even in Rishus HaYachid, we're geyser if you have those two different types of elevation, so to speak. So therefore, by the gagais, as far as really Me'ikradin, as far as the Eruv Chatzeres are concerned, it doesn't matter what the heights are. But we have this general gzera that called Malkam Shatam Shtei Rishus Jahin Rishus Achaz, that if you have two Rishuyas that are one, really they're all in the Rishus HaYachid, but they have different heights. Kigoyin Amud Rishus HaYachid Gavoya Sora Rachav Dalet, even if it's in Rishus HaYachid, but it's 10 high and 4 wide. Also, the Kasa Love, you can't put your bundles, you can't put your burdens on. Why gzera mishum tel b'shus harabim? Because of the gzera that you might have the tel in rishus harabim, you have an elevated area in the rishus harabim, which they're transferring from the rishus harabim to it as an isur deraisa, and therefore we are geyser, and all these cases even rishus hayachid. Therefore, we are geyser hachanami gzera mishum tel b'shus harabim. So we therefore say that over here, we're geyser by the different elevations of the rooftops. We're geyser because of this gzera, and therefore you can't transfer from one to the other. Now, the Rishonim speak out that this only applies, this gzera only applies to an outdoor area. Since the ikar of the gzera is mishum tel b'shus harabim, that's only if you have this in an open area. So the Ritval explains that this applies if you have an open area, like the rooftops, different elevations. Then you might come to be geyser auto atel b'shus harabim. But if you have it in an enclosed area, you have it in a house, or you have it in any enclosed area, which is not similar at all to the rishus harabim, we're not geyser. This gzera does not apply. So there's Gemara Savramino Afil Maptesh Afilo Gigas. Abai Baravan thought to say, well, and that therefore that would apply even if you have a case where, let's say you have a mortar or a barrel. So let's say you have those types of objects, and they're 10 high and 4 wide, that we would similarly apply the same gzera. But no, Amar Lo Abai Hachi Amar Lo Yama Rabbi Meir El Amud V'Alma Sarei Chaim. Where we're geyser something which is fixed in its place. We said these apply to things like a post or a millstone, where you grind with. Why? Since these things are stationary, then it more resembles, it's more similar to the case of atel, the case of a tel b'shus harabim, a mound in rishus harabim. That's something that's part of the ground. It's permanent. So therefore, the gzera, where geyser, are only things which are stationary, which are fixed in their places. But if you have a barrel, movable object, if you have a chair, a bench, it doesn't apply to those types of movable objects. Well, what do you mean the Rameir is geyser for Atu Tel B'Shus Harabim and items which are stationary? What about a wall? If you have a wall that's between two chatzeres, it's kavua, it's fixed. Rav Yehuda says, if you're going to say that Gagen Rishus La'atzman, Chatzeres Rishus La'atzman, Karpipis Rishus La'atzman, that according to Rameir, that rooftops are one Rishus, they're all considered one. So from roof to roof is mutter. Chatzeres reshus lasman. Chatzeres are also considered one, so from one chatzer to the other is mutter. Karpipis reshus lasman. And then karpipis are also considered one reshus. Now, therefore, transferring from a gag to a gag, even if it has different owners, is mutter. From a chatzer to a chatzer is also mutter. From a carpet to another carpet is also mutter. But from a gag to a chatzer to a gag, to a carpet is also. So now, my love the shore. So when he says you can transfer from one chatzer to another, so you have the koisler ben chatzeres. And according to Reb Meir, in such a case, you can transfer from one chatzer to the other. My love, the shor der kaisel. How are you transferring from one to the other? Isn't that you're transferring to the top of the wall, and then from the top of the wall to the other chatzer? So now, even though it has a height and it's 10 or more high and 4 wide, you can transfer from one to the other. Well, how do you transfer from one chatzer to the other? It must be you take it, put it on top of the wall, and from the wall you take it to the other side. Why isn't it also mishum des gzer of tel b'shus rabim huna bar Yehuda marsheshes lay? No, that's not how you're transferring. You're not transferring to the top of the wall. To put it on the top of the wall would be aser because of this gzer of tel b'shus rabim. It means to transfer it through an opening. It's through an opening, and the opening is therefore you're transferring it through the opening, but not putting it on top of a structure that's 10 high. But the Chacham say no, each rooftop is considered its own domain, and therefore, if the different rooftops are owned by different owners, you can't carry from one to the other. Well, what about on your own rooftop? What about each owner carrying on his own rooftop? Rav says, not only can he not carry from one rooftop to the other, he can't even carry on his own rooftop. Why is that? Because each roof is completely open to the other. So therefore, it's nifretz b'melua l'mokama asala. It's totally open to a place which is also. And therefore, since it's open, exposed to a place which is also which you can't carry, so therefore you can't carry even within your own rishus. And therefore, you can only carry within Dalet Amos, just like a Carmelis, which you cannot carry, you can only carry within Dalet Amos. Here also, the fact that it's open to a place where you can't carry into, Aser is carrying even into that own area. And therefore, Rav says, even on the person's own rooftop, he's restricted to only carry Dalet Amos. But Shmuel says, no, you can carry within your own rooftop. You can't carry from one to the other, but on your own you can. So the Gemara explains, when the roofs are separated by walls that are visible, meaning there's a separation between the houses. And so there's a separation between the rooftops. If you look down, you can see there's a wall here and there's a wall here. So therefore, you see that there's a wall between them, and therefore we would apply the principle and say that you can carry, because we say gudasik. The walls, we view them, this is Allah now we view gudasik, we would view the walls as extending upward. And therefore, l'halacha, we would consider it not open parts from one to the other, that it's completely open to one to the other, because we would view the walls as extending up. Good asik, the walls are extending up and they're separated. So there's no machlokes over there. In that case, each one would be able to carry unlimited on his own rooftop. When the walls are not visible, the buildings are attached, so you don't see that the walls below, and you don't see that over there. Rav says in this case where the walls are not visible, we don't say gudasik, and therefore there's no separation between the rooftops, and it's paras b'melua l'mokam ha'asula. So it's also to carry each one even on his own rooftop. Shmuel Amar mutal taltam b'kuloi. Shmuel says it's mutter because the Amar good asik mechitzasa. Because even in this case where the walls are not exposed, we still say good asik mechitzasa. So this is going to be the subject of the discussion on the next Amud in the Gemara.